Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first in a series of 3 virtual workshops about screens and COVID-19. This webinar is organized by Children and Screens, Institute of Digital Media and Child Development. My name is Pam Hurst Della Pietra, President and founder of Children and Screens. The Children and Screens Institute is now the nation's leading interdisciplinary scientific research organization that assesses the positive and negative impact of technology on children's health and well-being. During the pandemic, we are funding studies to understand how well screens are being used in positive ways for distance learning and maintaining social connections. Conversely, we are funding studies on the negative effects of screens arising from their compulsive use and the anxiety, depression, and other issues sometimes attributed to digital media. Furthermore, we are investigating the extent to which distracted parenting may have dramatically increased and how it may be impeding both the quality and the quantity of parent-child interactions. We strive to present you with the highest quality multidisciplinary dialogue and evidence-based guidance to support your families. Above all, we want you to know that if you're struggling with screen time issues, you're not alone. The COVID-19 crisis has profoundly affected all aspects of our lives, including parenting and digital media use. There are more than 500 people on this Zoom call seeking answers to questions similar to those you may have. Today's workshop will focus on managing very young children's screen time during the crisis. We are grateful to our excellent panel of experts for sharing their insights today. Our panelists have reviewed the questions you submitted and will answer as many as they can. If you have additional questions during the workshop, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many as we can. It is now my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce our moderator, Dr. Dimitri Christakis, Editor-in-Chief of the journal JAMA Pediatrics, Director of the Center for Child Health, Behavior, and Development at Seattle Children's Research Institute. Welcome, Dimitri.
Hi, Pam. Thank you very much, and thank all of you for joining us during this extraordinary time. Like you, I have been quarantined in my house for 6 weeks. It may show. Unlike you, my children are grown up, so I don't have the same challenges that you're facing, but our goal today is to try to help you with practical tips to make sure that being quarantined with you is as positive as it can be for your young children. I'm a pediatrician and epidemiologist by training, and as Pam said, I'm a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. I've been studying children and screens for about 20 years, since my first son was born. And I've had the privilege of serving on the advisory board of Children and Screens for, I think, about 5 years. Never before has the mission of Children and Screens, which is to help children live a healthy life in a digital world, been more important. As Pam said, as large a footprint as screen media leave in the lives of children, it's that much larger now. So we hope today to help you make screens work for your youngest children. And to put a little bit of context around that, as our panelists will show you, young children are undergoing an extraordinary developmental arc. Their brains are developing at an incredible pace. Their experiences that they have really make large material differences to them. The other thing I'll point out is that the age group that you're dealing with has very little evidence around distance learning. And in fact, I'm sure most of you are struggling with what it means for a kindergartner to possibly engage with the screen the same way they could with real children in a classroom. But the good news, if there is any good news around children and screens at this age, is that there are actually, for young children, for preschool age children, and we'll talk specifically about the ages we're referring to, high quality programs that have been shown to improve children's cognitive and emotional development. And we'll try to give you some guidance about how to find those program apps and how with them. Okay, so I think I've said enough. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, introduce himself and give you some tips. What we're going to try to do is have each of the panelists give some tips from their perspective about young children and screen. And then, as Pam said, we will leave plenty of time both for questions you've already submitted and for live questions you can submit through the chat box. John, this is John Hutton.
Thank you, Dimitri and Pam. And it's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. I'm a primary care pediatrician by training, and then I'm also the director of the Reading and Literacy Discovery Center at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Most of my research originally had involved reading in the brain. We use MRI, particularly functional MRI, to better characterize how early experiences around books and reading in the preschool age range can influence both the brain function and brain structure. More recently, we've been doing some research involving screen time, the effects potentially of different kinds of experiences with, for example, animated books, ebooks, and then screen time in general, and how that may influence the developing brain. I'm also a parent. I have 3 daughters like Dimitri. They're older. The youngest is 14. She's right in the thick of trying to address issues with distance learning as an adolescent, which has challenges of its own. But one of my main passions as a researcher and a clinician is in this early childhood space. So really what I hope to do today is to better frame this whole issue in terms of readiness, the idea that, as we say in pediatrics, that children, especially young children, are not small grown-ups, and what they need at different ages really changes as they develop, both emotionally, cognitively, and in terms of their brains. And so hopefully we'll be able to pass along some of that to frame the issue, which can be very challenging for today's parents. I am not envious of today's parents in terms of all the choices that are at their disposal in terms of different types of media, different apps, and other content. Which is healthy, which is not. So there's just so much to wrestle with, and we as researchers really have a lot of work to do. But hopefully we'll have some information to share with you that'll be helpful. I wanted to start this out by sharing a video that was provided to us by a couple of wonderful researchers working in early child development, particularly around language, Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and Roberta Galinkoff. And what it really shows is a really wonderful interaction between a parent and a 10-month or 10-week-old child, really engaged with one another and exchanging what we call child-directed speech. The parent making a sound, the child practicing it back, and this is really what we as parents strive for, is that engagement. And I really think that showing this can better anchor this situation and really raise the question of, if a screen or the content that's provided to kids through a screen can simulate this type of interaction, then this is going to be supportive of a child's development. But for now, we know the best way that it's conveyed is through this human interaction. But anyway, rather than keep talking about it, I want to show it to you.
Oh. 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 Oh.
So that's like clearly beautiful stuff. Even though what's being exchanged is very simple, oh, back and forth between the parent and the child, you can see that child is locked into their parent. They're really all in, and they're wanting to engage with them. And that's really what we're striving for in any early childhood experience, is recreating that interaction that is probably hardwired in kids' brains to need. So I don't want to provide too much of a lecture type situation, but I did create some slides that I want to share with you as well, to again frame the issue in terms of what does a child need in terms of their early development, and what can a screen do or not do to help them along the way. And really what this starts with, and it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, is the idea that as we say in pediatrics, children are not small grown-ups. There's a lot of things that we as humans have decided are important to wait to do. And they all are framed around the idea of, are we ready at different ages? So for example, kids for the most part are supposed to wait till they're 21 to drink beer. They wait to vote, they wait to drive a car. In the center is a classic picture of an infant interacting with an iPad where they're clearly very engaged with it, and they're attracted by the lights and what's in there. But the question is, are they ready to use it? And if they are ready to use it, what content within that app are they ready for? So I think that's just really an important concept in terms of looking at any type of media that a parent is potentially going to have their child use or use with them ideally, and just get a sense, keep that idea of readiness in mind. And I think so much of this really raises the question that we as researchers have so much work to do to better understand, what types of things are kids ready for at what ages, and what are they not ready for, and what kinds of recommendations should we make. So maybe we can jump to the next slide. All right, so this kind of frames the idea, again, I as a parent don't envy today's parents because of how quickly things have changed. One challenge as researchers is that the pace with which screen media is being developed far outpaces our ability to keep up with it in terms of research. In the 1960s, for example, the earliest age, or kids in general were starting to use screen media, and this was all television, around 3 years old or older. By 2020, that had dropped to, most kids on average are starting to use some type of screen by the time they're 2 to 4 months old. And by 2 years old, about 95% are using screens all the time, just because there's so much out there, and it's become such a huge part of how families live their lives. The reason that's an issue is that while the pace with which children are exposed to media or have media available to them has increased incredibly rapidly, what kids need in terms of different developmental stages really hasn't changed very much. 40 years or 50 years, the time it's taken to go from television to today's, tablets is really a blink, and is just such a small amount of time in terms of how our brains develop. And really our brains haven't changed much, if at all, during that time period. So kids at different ages, for example, a 3-year-old needs, they're sort of ready to learn basic grammar. They're in preschool, they're learning how to play with toys and use their imaginations, and are for the most part wanting to be more independent. So watching a television show or a movie, ideally with a caregiver, they may be ready for that. A 9-month-old, by comparison, is really just starting to learn how to make basic word sounds. They're learning how to pay attention, and they're developing a sense of basic trust. So what they would need from an experience with a screen is very different. They're probably not going to learn a whole lot in terms of skills for school, but they probably would benefit most from using a screen with a caregiver in an engaged, nurturing way, using it together where they would feel that sense of trust, could pay attention with somebody else, and practice with that person using some basic language sounds. A 4-month-old, by comparison, is really still in that nonverbal communication, like the infant in the video, where they're really all about bonding with their caregivers and starting to really just figure out the basics of how the world works. So again, this frames the issue that different ages really raise different requirements in terms of healthy development. And what we need to ask ourselves is, how well do today's technologies recreate these types of experiences that can help nurture these different skills? Let's go to the next one. The other issue that's important to keep in mind is how quickly the brain's developing in the first 5 years. This is a graphic that I didn't create, but it shows really well how sort of what we call the sensitive periods, the times when the brain is changing most rapidly, or what we call most plastic in response to an experience, really peaks in the first couple of years of life. The ones that peak earliest are sort of parts of the brain that are involved with really basic types of skills and processes, like vision and hearing and emotional control, in the sense of calming oneself down, tantrums, self-regulation, and then habitual ways of responding, like how a person responds to the world. That tends to peak in the first couple of years, and that's when those experiences are really important. Kids need to hear sounds, they need to see things, they need to learn how to calm themselves down. What we call higher order skills that are more complicated and you tend to see in school, are ones that still peak very early in the first couple of years, but they have a longer tail to them. So there's a lot more time that they're working on sort of developing these networks that are involved with language, social skills, reading. And while that takes longer to sort of to work with a child on, and their brains can change at any age, as you can see in those first 5 years, which is what we're focusing on here today, that's really where so much is going on really fast. And those early experiences are so important. Here I've got a picture, a little cameo of my dog. And this is really a little tangent, but I think anyone that wants a way, an antidote to screen time at this age should think about investing in a puppy, because we picked the best time to get a puppy, and it's a great way to spend a lot of quality time with outside of the laptop or phone. But anyway, so those early experiences in the first 5 years are so critical, and we need to be very mindful as parents and caregivers to make sure that what we're providing kids is helping their brains to grow in the most optimal way. Let's go on to the next one. So essentially most of my work is as a reading researcher. We've known for decades that reading is healthy for children. It's a great way to build their skills, to build their sense of connection, to build their imaginations, to build their brains. In the first 5 years, we've built a body of research using MRI to really what I call, sort of reinforce what every grandparent and every teacher knows, which is that reading is healthy and reading is good for kids' brains. But now we're actually starting to point at pictures that show what aspects of that early reading experience in the first 5 years really makes a difference in terms of how the brain functions and develops. And we know that kids that have more books at home, kids that are read to more often, help the brain in certain ways. The interactivity around reading, which is really important, asking questions during the book, pointing at pictures, talking about how the book relates to the world, is also very important in terms of stimulating the brain. A child's interest in reading, getting them engaged, getting them really paying attention by asking those questions can help their brain. And then the other question that comes up is format. Is the book being read? Is it a book with pages, or is it on an iPad? And if it's on an iPad or a tablet, what kinds of animated features does it have? Does it have lots of bells and whistles? Does it, every time you touch the cow, does it moo? Are there things happening outside of just the text and the pictures that are potentially distracting or create more aspects of the story to process? What we've learned is all these things are important in different ways, and this is all involving kids under 5, preschool age kids. But in terms of the type of book, it seems like the simpler the book, the better, with less of the kind of stuff going on outside of the text and the pictures. Probably because kids at that age their brain capacity is still relatively limited, and they still really do benefit from having someone read the book with them so that they can better practice saying words, look at the pictures, and talk about what they're experiencing. It probably answers a question that might come up later, which is what types of ebooks and others are good for kids. And it really is the simpler, the better, where the grown-up is actively involved. Because the thing about books that's probably most helpful, it's not so much there's something magic about a book with pages, it's just that it really requires that human interaction, which is probably the secret sauce of reading with kids. It's not so much the content in the books and the pictures, which are all wonderful, it's creating that experience, that human interaction that is amazing when it involves a book with pages or an ebook where the parent and child or other caregiver and child are interacting. But a risk is when the tablet or device does all the work and takes the human out of the equation. The tablets where you can click a button and the story reads to the child without anyone else participating, those are probably less helpful for kids at this age than books where the humans are all actively engaged. Let's keep going. We're almost finished with the lecture part of this. The other question that comes up is, when you talk about reading and the brain, we've got a lot of evidence that it's helpful, it's beneficial. And the next question is, well, what about screen time? And that's really what we're all here to talk about. We published a study in the fall, which was the first study to look at that question specifically and say, well, what about early exposure to screen time? Not just how many minutes per day, but what types of screens? Where are the screens? Are they in the bedroom? What types of content? And if the child is on the screen, are they using it with somebody? We used a measure that recreates the guidelines that have been issued from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which look at screen time in 4 major domains. Where is the screen, which we call access? How much is the screen being used, which is minutes per day, and at what age? What type of content? And then is there co-viewing? Is the parent and child using it together? And in this study, we found that while families that showed more reading together, which is the image on the left, families that had more frequent reading, more books in the house, more interaction around books, had evidence, and this is a picture of the brain showing the left hemisphere where language and reading skills develop, had stronger connections shown in the red blobs in parts of the brain that support these processes, language and literacy. And then the graph at the bottom shows higher skills as well for kids with more reading. Screen time, by contrast, using that measure I mentioned, was really the opposite. Kids with more screen time had evidence of weaker connections in their brain, in parts of their brain connecting areas involved with language and reading skills, and also lower skills. This is not the definitive study to scare everybody to death and show, now we know the answer. What it is, it's a first look at this question, that it seems like there are differences in how early reading experiences affect the brain and then how screen experiences affect the brain. What this means long-term, we still don't know, but what we need to do, in my opinion, is to be cautious and to really make sure that we do the research we need to do and understand what we need to understand to make the best recommendations for parents so they understand what types of screen experiences are most healthy or most risky at different ages, so that we can help kids during this really important brain development, this important period of brain development, to develop as healthy as possible. And let's go to the final screen here. Speaking of screens. So now finally, I'll wrap sort of my section up with really just trying to anchor this. And again, this is sort of from the perspective of a researcher, but also as a pediatrician and a parent, is really there's some really core principles to think about in this early childhood 0 to 5-year-old space that can help anchor the idea about what does a child need from a screen to help them, both in terms of their skills, their emotional development, and their brain development. So one is the question of what's been called a video deficit. And even though this has become more controversial recently with some of the types of media beyond television, there's a lot of evidence that kids under age 2 for sure seem to learn a lot less, if at all, from screens. And a lot of this research was done involving television, which is very passive, and possibly with some more interactive quote media, there could be some differences, but it seems like under 2, there's really some limitations in terms of what kids learn from screens. There's also, this is probably a byproduct of limited processing capacity. Kids' brains are growing fast, but they're not fully developed. So that means there are going to be constraints on their memories, their attention, their understanding. And so the types of media they're presented with, really it's important for it to be very simple, very what we call pro-social, slow moving, and gentle to help them to better keep track of it. The next is learning tends to work best in terms of a social context. That's just how our brains have evolved, involving humans interacting with each other, where there's a lot of evidence that, particularly in terms of language, that kids, as the one in the first video showed, they really tend to lock in and start to really process sounds and language when a human caregiver is engaging with them. The next principle is what we call scaffolding, which is the idea that when a child is learning something, they really do it best gradually. They can build on what they've learned before with help, almost like stacking a tower of blocks. You got the first 2 blocks stacked, then someone helps them get the 3rd one on there, and next thing you know, you've got a castle. So next, there's some evidence in terms of brain development that some of these human interactions involve really literally brains syncing with each other, and this is the parent and the child, when they're playing and they're really locked into an experience, whether it's around a book or toys or whatever, that actually their brains sync up and they start to really get into that sort of really wonderful experience of spending time together. And there's really some evidence that this is something that's evolved to help kids learn. And then finally, the idea of really when learning something, using all the senses is a great way for kids to sort of learn things from different angles. They learn what they smell like, what they feel like, what they taste like. They taste books all the time. And so involving multiple senses as much as possible is helpful. That's an issue with screens sometimes because there can be some limitations in the senses that are stimulated. And then all this points to the idea of the importance of practice. You know, practicing anything, whether it's language, learning to calm oneself down, responding to boredom, quote unquote, all takes practice. You know, kids, I think, need a little time to be able to deal with being bored, because that's how they learn to make up their own games, to build their, you know, to really build those imaginations. And then the same with understanding social skills, connecting with others, and imagination. All this takes practice. It doesn't come for free. So in this early childhood space, it really is important to nurture these skills as much as possible. And again, the question is, to what degree are the apps and videos and other things that we're using, and you can look at what you've got in your own homes, help reproduce these? Are they interactive? Are they multisensory? Are they really helping to get the children engaged with other people? And then as parents, it's just important to, you know, again, this isn't to make parents depressed or feel guilty or anything. It's really just to frame expectations. You know, a child, especially during COVID, there's more time where, you know, parents are working, everyone's home, there's not childcare. Children, you know, they definitely need to be, you know, engaged and entertained, and parents won't always have that time just to spend playing blocks with them or reading stories. A child can watch a video and that's just fine, but it's important to frame that in terms of, are they learning or are they being entertained? And being entertained is okay, and it within limits. So if a child's watching a movie while the parent is doing work or making dinner, that's really just fine, as long as the parent understands that in terms of the child learning and building their skills, there probably are more effective ways to do that in terms of a human interaction. And really that's about all I'm gonna say. I'm gonna hand it off to the next person. I really appreciate your attention and look forward to questions.
Thanks, John. That was very helpful. Again, I want to emphasize that we'll have plenty of time for questions, for practical questions of all of our experts. Next, I want to introduce Brandon. Brandon, you want to introduce yourself and give us some tips from your perspective as a researcher and parent?
Yeah, thanks so much. So glad to be here. Brandon McDaniel, I'm a research scientist, and I would also call myself a digital health educator. So I'm a research scientist at the Parkview Miro Center for Research and Innovation in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I have a lot of experience working directly with families, help them develop healthy digital habits, and researching family interactions with technology and screens, trying to understand family management of screen time, how parents, and really focus it back in on ourselves, on parents' own device use and how that can impact family interactions and impact children directly. I'm also a parent myself, have 3 children, and keep wondering if a child's going to run in here in the middle of this, which I feel like is what a lot of us are experiencing, is having to work and manage our families at the same time. So I have some slides as well that I had prepared here. So let me get this shared for everyone. All right. I believe everyone can see that now. So I just wanted to give some general tech tips here. These are supposed to be small and simple things, because I believe that we can't do everything right now. We can't be superheroes and manage everything perfectly, and it's okay. I think that's the message I really want to communicate today, which is that you're okay. It's okay to be struggling. We're all struggling. We're all kind of stuck in the same boat together of trying to manage so many different things that there's no way we're going to be perfect at everything. And so I'm just going to try to communicate a few things to you that if we do a few of these things, and these small things might actually make a big difference in our families. So again, this is an unprecedented time, and I want to recognize that. We're all stressed out. We have so many things we're trying to do. We're trying to care for ourselves, care for our children. Maybe e-learning, depending on your child's age. Maybe your child's in kindergarten, and you're trying to manage that too, your job, and all the changes that have come along with everything. But I want to reiterate one of the points that John made, which is that child development hasn't changed. So the needs of children and what we need to remember hasn't changed. And so one of the things that when we're talking about very young children and infants that they need is sensitivity, or for their parents to be responsive to them and their needs. And a lot of times when I bring up sensitivity with parents or students or others, the first thing you think about is just like being warm and kind. Like, oh, they're just so warm, nice. And that's a part of it, but really there's 4 components to it. So it's more than that. It's that we're aware of our child's needs, that we interpret the cues that they give us, or their little bids for attention, that we interpret those correctly, that we're able to respond in some sort of a timely manner. Now that'll look different. I can't give you a rule of thumb to say like, hey, you have to respond in 3 seconds. That's not what I'm saying. It kind of depends on, you know, you'd probably respond faster to the fact if they fell down the stairs or something extreme than if they just, I don't know, wanted a snack for the 15th time in that hour. But responding in a timely way, and then also responding appropriately. A lot of what I've studied is looking at the potential for distraction and interruptions in our family interactions or in our interactions with our children. And we know that we have our phones with us all the time now, and so many devices all around us, and we get really connected to these devices. And now that we're all stressed out, and a lot of us feeling very anxious or bored or all these other feelings, we know that to fill those needs, a lot of people, and a lot of times we will turn to our devices even more in those situations. And so that's something I wanted to bring up today, is that to be aware a little bit of our device use and how our own device use, especially while we're around our children, can start to impact the quality of the parenting that we're able to give them. I really just took those four aspects of sensitivity in that last slide and showed you that it can impact all those things. It can make us less aware of the cues that the child is giving us. It can make it to where, since we're on our device, we're not as clued into what they're saying or what they're doing or what they're feeling, and we misinterpret maybe what they need. It can delay our response. And at times in the research, we actually find that maybe because you're so engrossed in what you're doing sometimes, or you're doing something that's really important, maybe with work, that it can get a little stressful and frustrating. And so you might respond sometimes in a way that's not as sensitive, that you wouldn't have responded if you hadn't been using your device. So I just want to bring that up. Some ways to try to combat some of these things, because we're all on these devices all the time, and many of us trying to manage both our work and our children, is to create some sort of a plan. It's not going to go perfect. It's not going perfect in my home. I don't expect it to go perfect. I mean, there's just so much that we're trying to manage at the same time with our work and our children and so many other aspects of our lives right now. But if we have some sort of a plan, I promise you that things are going to go better than if you had no plan at all. And I also want to say that perhaps you're so stressed out that you don't have to go at this in the sense that like everything has to be planned down right to every single minute. You can make it a flexible plan. You just want to have some sort of plan. And I think the thing to focus on most specifically with what we're talking about is thinking about what times of the day would you like screens to happen, and what times of the day do you not want screens to happen, and try to think about how you're going to make that happen, and what kinds when will they use screens, when will they not, and when you're not going to use screens, thinking about what you are going to do with the child or what the child is going to do by themselves, because screens are rather attractive, and you know, it'll go better if you have some sort of schedule, and after they get into a routine. We get stuck in routines and what we call loops in our families, where it's a struggle sometimes to change some of those. But I promise you that if you set up some sort of a plan and keep working on that plan, that over time it will become easier to stay inside of that plan. The American Academy of Pediatrics has also made recommendations to families to make family media plans, and you can go to their website, which is healthychildren.org/media use plan, and that will guide you through a variety of steps on creating a plan. Now, this might be too intense for you right now. because of everything you have going on, and there are a lot of different steps and things to think about in making like a complete, complex media use plan. But I wanted to give this to you so that you could go there if you'd like to look at it and get some ideas of some things you could think about. Just don't try to bite it off all at the same time right now. It's just too much. Okay, it's too much to try to do all at once. Focus on some of the most important or small pieces, which is what I was saying in this last slide of just focus on what times of the day would you like screens to happen, what times of the day do you not, and think about how you're going to make that happen and what kinds of activities you might do or not do or have the children do. Thinking about how we now are having to manage, again, ourselves and our families and our work and all those things, we may not be able to spend as much quality time with our children, or it just may look very different and be a real struggle. So I think one thing that we can focus on in a small way is to have focused family time or focused family times. So really you're trying to think about like a probing or a searching question you could have for yourself right now is thinking, how is the connection going with my child? Or how is the connection with my family going right now? And how can I create that? And some small ways to do that are to set up some tech-free times or some tech-free zones during your day. So these are things that you've thought about beforehand, you've put into your plan, and you've thought, okay, an example of a tech-free time might be lunch and dinner. I'm always gonna, yes, I have to work all day, but I'm gonna set up that you know, at these certain times, so like with lunch, there's not gonna be any screens, and I'm gonna completely focus on my child and have this really high quality interaction and the back and forth like John was showing in that video. I'm going to make sure and have these sorts of high quality experiences with my children. Another idea with like a tech-free zone is, for example, in mine, I don't bring my phone into my child's bedroom because I just know that the only thing that that's going to do is distract me from the interactions and the time I'm spending with my child in their room. And so I treat it's sort of like treating our certain times of the day or certain zones of our house as sacred spaces where we're going to focus on creating high quality family experiences. And then eye contact. For myself, for example, I'll just use myself as an example. A lot of times I'm having to work during the day now. I'm on my computer researching things and trying to help parents with everything that's going on. And my own child walks in, which I keep wondering if it's going to happen even during this workshop, walks in and is like, you know, Dad, can I have a snack or whatever it is? And I could just keep on working and say, no, you can't have a snack, you know, pretend I'm just staring at my computer right now and working. But what is really important is as human beings, we relate to one another through eye contact. And it really shows how much we care about what the other person is saying and feeling if we can make eye contact. So instead of doing that, I try to remember to turn and to look at my child and to talk directly to them, even if the answer is still going to be something like, I'm sorry, Daddy's working right now. I cannot help you. I'll be there in like 5 minutes. But I've made eye contact, and that it changes the quality of our interaction. It changes how they feel about what's happening to them. So just to summarize again, I think coming up with some sort of a media plan, at least a flexible, small one, and setting up some of those tech-free times and tech-free zones, and making eye contact can really help. And just again, I want everyone to remember, you're human. It's okay to be struggling right now, and it's okay to be a little lenient sometimes, you know, with the screens, if screens need to happen in a specific moment because of something that's happening, or you're just so stressed out that you're going to blow, or whatever it is. We're all in this together, and if we put some of these tips in place, things are going to go better than what they are right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. It was some really helpful advice. I'm sure parents will have a lot of specific questions for you. And last, but by no means, Dr. Ellen Rortella, a dear friend who's been studying this probably, well, I don't want to say longer than anyone, Ellen, because that will make people know just how young you are. But go ahead, Ellen, introduce yourself and tell us what you have to say.
Thank you, Dimitri. Yes. I have been studying children and media for quite a long time, since I was a graduate student when the medium of the day was television. I am my title is Althani Professor of Communication at Northwestern University, and I have been studying media and children from so many directions that I also have appointments in psychology, medical social sciences, and social policy. The work that I do, I also direct a center on media and human development where I run my research grants, and I do a lot of research on children and media. The work that I do is at the nexus of social and public policy questions, where when new technologies come along, parents obviously want to know what impact these are having on their children. So social and public policy questions, child development, and we've heard a lot this morning from John and in particular about the particular nature of children in these first 5 years and how important that stage of development is for the children's growth, and media studies. So I also study what's the nature of the type of technologies available to children at different ages and the sorts of content that they have. Rather than spending a whole lot of time reiterating some of the things you've heard from John and Brandon already, I'd like to get to questions, but let me highlight a few things that I think are tips and are important to remember. First of all, there's a lot of data and a lot of evidence that the most important things that we should care about when we think about children and media is the nature of the child that we're talking about, the specific content, and not necessarily the technology that they're using. And by technology, I mean, is it a television, or is it a laptop computer, or is it a cell phone, or is it an iPad? Although I think there are some differences there, and the context. One of the things we know from the whole history of studying child development, going back to the 1920s and 30s, is that the most efficacious way in which children develop is when they have a caring adult or caregiver around them, and they're interacting with interesting objects or an interesting world around them, that this propels development for them. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of children's interactions with screens. And here I think there is a difference between television, which, as we pointed out, was more passive in directing media and information to children, and some of the more interactive technologies like iPads and cell phones, where the child can engage in an interaction. So the first thing we need to remember is that media can be both not very helpful, and we all know that media violence is particularly not helpful for children and has pretty negative impacts, but it can also be a wonderful resource when it's used much more thoughtfully, selectively, and with clear parental oversight. And in this day and age with the COVID crisis and the lockdowns, I've been in my house for 6 weeks now too, we need to be able to think about ways in which we can thoughtfully and maybe a little bit more selectively use media with our child. So the first thing we need to think about is the child, and who is our child? And boy, as a parent, you know your child better than anyone else. And by child, I mean that there are variations in what's appropriate for a child depending on whether they're boys or they're girls, what their age is. And clearly we point out that a 4-month-old is very different from even a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old. And we also know that there are personality differences. Is your child an anxious child? Do they have difficulty going to sleep? Are they afraid of, my older son was afraid of spiders, as I recall, when he would get upset whenever he saw even a picture of a spider. So you need to know what the nature of your child is, and you're the best person to identify that. So just remember that variations in how media are used is really largely dependent on who that child is. But second to that, not all content is the same. So we really need to know what is the content that they're engaging with. It's not just that they may be using an iPad or watching television right now, but is the content age appropriate? We know that PBS has wonderful preschool shows for children, but there are also preschool apps that are available, and there are online sites that you can go to access preschool information. We want to know, is the not only age appropriate, but does the content fit your family values? Does it present a kind of content that you're interested in having your child attend to? We also know that we have some sorts of content that can be very upsetting to children, either emotionally or behaviorally have a negative impact on them. And so you need to watch and make sure that the child is attending to a content that you find appropriate, both for your family and for your age of your child. And we also know that there's content that's educational versus non-educational. And I guess it was really the advent of both Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and later Sesame Street in the 60s, 1960s, that were able to demonstrate that not all television was bad, but you could produce educational content that could have both a beneficial learning effect on children, but also an effect on their social emotional development. So the child is important to know, and you know your child best, the content that they're attending to. And if you want to get some examples of good content, I'd recommend going to Common Sense Media, which is available online, and they have a lot of recommendations there of what are appropriate kinds of content that you can expose your child to at different ages. And then lastly, the context. And by context here, I think the most important thing in this time where we're all cooped up in our homes is that joint media engagement, where the adult is engaging with the child around the media, is the best context possible. I know we can't do that all the time because parents have other things to do, but to the extent that you take up Brandon's recommendations of having a media plan, or John's recommendations of knowing how to engage with your child in multiple contexts, then the extent to which you as the adult caregiver can engage with your child, even if it's at a limited amount of time while they're attending to the media content, if it's television or something in an app, can be most beneficial. And what do you do then? You point out the things that you want your child to notice. You repeat words about some of the objects that are on the content. You talk to your child about what's on TV. At this early age, between birth and age 5, language development is crucially important, as we've heard. And you can use the content on the media screen as content that you can use to help teach your children language, to teach them more about the world that you want them to know about. So why don't I end there so that we can move on to some of your questions. But what's most important in this age is to have caring adults who are aware of their child's needs, who are exposing them to the best educational content available, and in particular, in a context in which you and your child are engaging, if possible, or at least in which the child is safe and shown that they are being taken care of by the family. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Okay, so we're going to open up for live questions. I see some are already coming in. I guess probably one of the most burning questions parents see it coming across the screen now is how much screen time should we be allowing, and should we make exceptions during the period? So the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines for young children ages 18 to 5, full disclosure, I was one of the authors of that, says 1 to 2 hours. I'll ask John this. So I disclosed my affiliation so he can feel free to challenge me. John, should we be relaxing the screen hours? And if so, what guidance do you have for parents about how much time? And I should emphasize this is recreational screen time. John, I think you're muted.
Again, so that is a really tough question, and you know, there are different organizations that have put out guidelines, like Dimitri said. The AAP recently revised in 2016 said kids under 18 months should really be discouraged screen time in general, and then for older kids, 1 to 2 hours of entertainment screen viewing. The World Health Organization, by contrast, issued more conservative guidance last year, really discouraging screen time under age 5. So, and their reason to say that wasn't so much they had a lot of evidence that, yes, it's definitely bad under 5, it's just that there's so much we don't know, where they urged more caution around screen time. As far as during COVID, I would go back to the idea that really and probably also nodding to Ellen's point that, you know, knowing your child and your family, you know, what is the family able to accomplish in terms of putting those restrictions in place? You know, if both parents have to be on a call or making dinner and the child just has no other option other than to watch a show, then that would be a reason to potentially relax those restrictions. But if there are other activities available, again, back to the idea that stage of brain development, you know, what a child needs hasn't changed, even if the situation has changed, I would still adhere as closely as you can to the restrictions. But again, being realistic on what's possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think one of the challenges parents face in trying to put strict limits around their kids' screen time is that they're going to find that they're also multitasking, which is to say they're trying to work, trying to entertain their kid, trying to have their kid entertain themselves, and all of the experiences are diminished. For me, I think it's really important that parents try to compartmentalize their days so that when there's time when they need to do concentrated work, that's the time to use high quality educational screen time. But make sure you then follow that with time where you're compartmentalizing play or engagement with your child. And as Brandon said, you shut the computer down, you put the phone away, you spend an hour with your child in a developmentally appropriate way, inside, outside, completely focused on their needs. And keep in mind that children would be getting that kind of experience in a normal classroom for 6 to 7 hours a day. They need about that much time. It's going to be hard for parents to provide that, but that's about the amount of time they need.
And Dimitri, I just quickly would get into that. That's an excellent point where the AAP guidelines are often referenced in terms of the restrictive aspect of it, but one aspect that's not as well emphasized is the guidelines also say to encourage constructive non-screen activities. So not so much focusing on what is the limit, but what are the constructive things we could do, whether it's reading, play, or otherwise, during those focused times. I mean, I think that's at least as important, making sure those are emphasized.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I mean, it's interesting. One of the most common reasons people put even their youngest ones in front of a screen is because they frequently say they can't think of other ways to entertain them, or they can't think of how they could make dinner without putting their child in front of a screen. And the truth is that children as young as 18 months would love to help in the kitchen. Children as young as 6 months can sit on the floor with a bowl and bang away and find it perfectly pleasurable. It won't make dinner making any easier, but it's not necessarily a time where children need to be parked in front of a screen. So a lot of you alluded to it, and a lot of people allude to educational content. And so I guess, Ellen, can you help parents, without just directing them to Common Sense Media, how do they decide on what programming or what app is educational for their child, and how do they assess if it's actually doing that?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because today's app developers and DVD developers and all kinds of developers know that if you want to sell something to a parent of a preschool child, all you have to say is that it's educational and parents will buy it. And unfortunately, the research that's been done specifically around apps over the last 4 or 5 years has suggested that a lot of the apps that claim to be educational really don't have much educational content at all. So just looking at the content itself is very difficult. So where do you go? Which is why I suggest going to Common Sense Media, because they can give you some advice. But here are some things you can look at when you look at the program itself, particularly for children of this age group. Is it of slower pace? Is it content that is trying to get the child to engage outside of the medium? So let me give you an example of that. Tokaboka has some apps in particular that try to have children engage in the kind of pretend play that they like when they're younger than 5, or engage in looking at different objects and searching them. So what you have to do is look at the content and see if it's calming, see if there's some material in there that connects to what you know your child is interested in. If it's a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old and they're interested in dolls, is it a content that talks about dolls? And there are some contents and apps that do that. And thirdly, it doesn't just have to teach them their numbers or about science or about math, but is it thoughtful in the way that it engages your child to push them beyond the screen, in the way it engages your child with the values that you care about as a parent, and if it has the kind of impact that is a calming impact on the child as opposed to a frenetic impact. Those are the sort of things that I would look at. And I would also ask my friends, One of the things that I'm learning a lot about is I have graduate students who have young children, and they come to me and say, can I let my child watch this? My friend X said that it's a good app. And I say, well, take a look at it, see if it is good. But ask your friends what sorts of apps and what sorts of programming and content that they're attending to. Also, you might go to the PBS website as another site besides the site that Common Sense Media. Public television has been a place in which they point out what are appropriate educational shows. Those educational shows have apps now, they have other kinds of materials, and that might be another source of information.
Thanks, Ellen. Those are all really good tips. I guess I would just add that, to add on to what you're saying, is that the best way, I think, for parents to decide whether or not a show is educational or a program is educational is to actually assess whether or not the child is actually learning. It should be obvious to you what it's trying to teach, right? In the old days of Sesame Street, the show was brought to you by the letter G. You knew what the purpose of the show was, and at the end of it, let's talk about it to begin with G and see if in fact you're getting out of it.
That's actually a good point, which I should have mentioned, is watch your child interacting with the content themselves. If they're engaged in talking back and repeating what they've seen, those are all examples that they're actively trying to make sense of and are probably learning something from it. But you're absolutely right. You can tell by the way they're interacting with the content and what they take away from it.
Right. And I should point out that people should also be concerned about particular types of apps that can really be so engaging for children, they find it very difficult to disengage. And a lot of the work we're doing in the lab now is around compulsive use of apps, even in very, very young children. I think it's
really
the risk parents need to be mindful of. Okay, this one's for you, Brandon. And I think it's a really important one that a lot of people are wondering about. How can parents who are trying to work from home feel less guilty about their child's technology use?
Oh, what a great question. And I mean, I'm on our mental health commission here in our hospital system, and in terms of the messaging that we're putting out, and that is such a difficult question, and one that doesn't have an easy answer for any of us as parents. I want to reiterate the point I had made earlier about how it's okay to be struggling right now, and it's okay to not be perfect, and it's okay to mess up, and it's okay to maybe be having some more screen time than was happening before. And if you can just help yourself, and if you can just remember that at least us as experts in this area have come to you and said, it's okay, and you are okay. That can help a little bit to remember that. Now, you're probably still going to feel guilty sometimes. And I think that's where, going back to some of the tips that we gave you and trying to focus on how can I create some of these high quality, highly focused times with my children, where I'm not going to be trying to multitask all of the time, where interactions are really being degraded in quality, and I'm just sticking my kids in front of screens and all of that. So looking for creating that some sort of a plan and trying to stick to that in some way and figure out, okay, I'm going to work from this time to this time, and I'm going to try to put these activities in place, or there is going to be this type of educational screen use I'm having my child use, but then from noon to 1, I'm going to take lunch, and I'm going to focus on just my child during this time, and so on and so forth, and trying to figure that out. And if we're talking about really young kids, one thing I'd add on to that is, older children, you can probably do that where it's like, well, I'm not going to focus on you at all right now for this longer period of time, and I'm going to focus on you a lot during this period of time. But our really young children, like we're talking about right now, need a lot of interaction and parents focus, and that makes it very difficult. And so if you're struggling, it makes sense that you're struggling, and it's okay. And so trying to find ways where you can take lots of small breaks throughout the day, even if it's only for 5 minutes, if there's a way for you to work that in so that you can continually come back to your child. And that'll also help you to be able to manage some of those limits you were trying to set too, because you're continually checking back in.
Does anyone have any other comments on that?
If I could chime in on that a little bit, I think that's an excellent point, and it really raises the question of not only is COVID a challenge for for the parent and the child, but for the parent themselves, in terms of looking at how in what a vast way technology has impacted the way we parents live our lives, you know, and these opportunities where maybe a parent feels guilty or feels conflicted, I think is an opportunity to look at how technology has invaded our lives as parents, and ask the questions, you know, do I need to check my Facebook right now? You know, it's 8 o'clock. Do I need to be working from home right now? You know, all the things that it seems like we're forced to do by having digital devices that can interfere with our ability to interact with our child. But it's sort of an opportunity to take stock of those and really to maybe make some changes that can help the parent feel more relaxed about their own ability to disengage from technology while spending more time with their child. But on the other hand, if there's a meeting and I've got to be on this meeting and there's no other choice around it, then that's, you know, the guilt can go away, and you know, there's really not a you know, I mean, that's just the reality of whatever the workplace demands. Anyway, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, I think it's really important that parents also emphasize their own mental health, because if you're not in a good position, you're certainly not be in a good position to help your children. Here's a question about how to help children transition off a screen. We talked a lot about letting them be on a screen during certain times, but how do you minimize tantrums when you try to get your 3 or 4-year-old to get off the screen? Anyone want to take a crack at that, or should I pick on someone?
I have very vivid memories of my younger son throwing a tantrum in a restaurant when we took I think it was a book, actually. It wasn't even a screen away from him, and he was furious. Wow, that's a hard one. Sometimes you have to let them have a bit of a tantrum, particularly if it's at home, while you say that there are limits, and you have to teach them that there are things that they can and can't do. And of course, you try to distract them with other things. As you pointed out, Dimitri, if you're in the kitchen and you can't keep them in front of the screen right now because you have other things that you have to do, giving them pots and pans to play with, giving them books to play with, giving them other objects that they like around the house. My son loved one of the covers to a pillow that he always wanted to hold, I recall. So try to distract them, try to give them other things. And if they're going to be throwing a tantrum, then you have to try to cope with that tantrum. But again, this is not a moment in which you have a lot of hard and fast rules, that you have to make it through the day, both for the parent's sake and for the child's sake. And so maybe when you say how much is an appropriate amount of screen time and you're trying to limit it, well, maybe in this day and age, too much, we know, if they're doing media all day long. But other than that, I say we try to make it an environment in which there isn't a lot of yelling and screaming in the house, if at all possible. And so you try to distract the child, you try to hug the child, you try to show the child that you care, and you try to find other things for them to do, coloring and playing with pots and pans, and organizing their toys, organizing their books, things that'll keep them engaged is the best thing that I could suggest.
Anyone else have any comments, John or Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to add that, you know, you're talking about, you remember back when your children did that. Like, I was just thinking about like earlier this morning or last night, and it's like, yes, that happens, you know, so it doesn't matter. Like that's what I was trying to say with the plans and all those things. The best plan is going to go wrong. The setting the limits is going to create these times where the child doesn't want to follow the limits sometimes, and that's okay. And so, and that's where I feel like trying to anticipate, you know your child again, so trying to anticipate when those are going to happen and when they usually happen, and mentally preparing yourself for that, because you still want to set the limit, and you want to be able to control your own emotions in that situation, as opposed to blowing up on them because they're throwing a tantrum, and so just preparing yourself for that, and continuing on, and it will pass. Sometimes it's pretty intense for a while, though.
John, we got a question here about Zoom or Skype or FaceTime. Should that count as screen time? Should it on it? Is there an age at which it's appropriate or inappropriate? What are your thoughts? And I'll actually ask well, depending on what you say, I might ask others too.
Yeah, I think that FaceTime was actually excluded, was exempted from the AAP regulations for the reason that it is a feasible way for a child to interact with a caregiver. You know, for example, a parent who's stationed overseas or a grandparent who lives on the opposite side of the country. And there is some evidence that kids, even little ones, can meaningfully interact through FaceTime with a grown-up. Probably there are limits on how much they really understand, you know, what the screen is doing. I mean, they see somebody there and they are interacting with them. Again, whether they would learn from it is another issue. But I think in terms of a communication device, there is definitely some value there. I would probably reserve it more for situations and for little kids where it's necessary, where you sort of are communicating with someone far away that you have to do and you don't have the option to go see them in person. But it's, you know, I think there definitely is some value to FaceTime as an interactive tool.
If I can interject too, historically, the concern has always been, I'd say, much more about the content than the technology. So content that allows children to see other places like Zoom, I think is not problematic because it can be used to talk to their grandparents, to talk to if they're 4 or 5, their friends next door, to do a bunch of things. And that's why these new technologies, which allow for entertainment, which is usually what people have been concerned about when they talk about content, not talking to your grandparents over a screen, but are they watching some sort of content, violent or otherwise content that you don't like. So I think what's important here is that you know that your child is engaging with content that you find acceptable, and that right now, when we're all locked in, giving them access to people who may even be next door, but they can't see or they can't get to. So I don't think that communication through screens is in any way necessarily problematic for children, young children.
I agree. And I should point out that we should also think about the broader public health implications, right? So, I mean, you know, the grandparent who's locked in may really get a lot of solace from seeing their 6-month-old grandchild, even if he or she can't meaningfully interact with them. So I think there are potential benefits that go beyond the individual child. Given that there's no harm, they can provide some joy in the life of somebody else who would love to see them, even if they can't be with them.
Completely agree.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say the difference is really that interactivity and using these things for connection. That's good. I mean, that's one thing I've communicated to parents over and over again, is that it's okay. And that's one thing to even think about. For many children, and I know I'm going up in middle childhood a little bit, but many children have been pulled out of their social groups and away from their friends. But even my child who was in preschool, like, he's no longer in preschool. And so finding ways to be able to connect them with their friends and their peers through this video chat and those things can be really helpful to them.
And here's a suggestion for that too. I mean, why not, while we're looking for activities for parents to do with their kids that aren't screen-based, is why not FaceTime grandma, say, oh my gosh, that was great seeing grandma, let's write grandma a letter now, or let's draw a picture of grandma, or let's, you know, to use that as a scaffold, as a way to extend beyond the screen to an activity that's off the screen. You know, it could be a nice
or
thing.
have grandma read a book that they can show. There are other ways that the interaction can be 2 ways in that sense. Yes.
That's great. Okay. Someone says that their child's preschool has sent content for their 6-month-old to watch. Live video content. What do people think of that?
I'm not a huge fan of that. I think it would sort of again, at 6 months, you know, I would wonder what the content is. You know, 6-month-olds really are trying to figure out how the real world works. And you know, one of the issues I have with a lot of video content for kids at that age that present real world things through the video, like the sky or birds or something like that, is why not just go out and look at the sky or look at a bird. So and we also know that use of screens at a younger age strongly predicts more use as kids get older. So to me, that 6 months, mostly you would be accomplishing training the child to want to use more screen time. So I don't see a huge benefit of that personally.
I have
I
no
would
idea.
agree. I don't. Go ahead.
I have no idea what the content is or what it's intended to do, or if it's to keep the child connected just with the people in the daycare center. I mean, is it just pictures of them? It's just, there isn't enough information to know really what it's about. I mean, how different is it from using Zoom with a grandparent, or is this content to remind the children of who their caregivers are in the daycare center? I mean, it's just hard to tell.
Okay.
Yeah, you really have to be careful about certain content that's presented, especially as Ellen said, that's presented as educational for kids at young ages that is unrealistic in terms of what a child can potentially learn. So for example, a video about learning the alphabet for a 6-month-old is not really something that's even really feasible for them to be learning. Really keeping track of what kids can reasonably learn at certain ages is really, really important. And in that first year, it really is all about really basic language, emotional connection, relationships, multisensorial. So anyway.
Okay, here's a question. How long should school Zoom sessions be in one setting for 2 to 5-year-olds? They read live stories or do Spanish and music class for, I guess this is a preschool somewhere. Do people have any sense of how long they should be? Or my sense is that we can't give a general answer about how long. It really is a matter of each individual child and how engaged they are in the screen. But I don't think at that age parents should treat it at all like school, and that if they're not watching intently, they are missing out on something important. What do others think?
I agree completely with you, Dimitri, that it really depends on whether the child's engaged, and if the child isn't engaged, don't feel guilty about taking the child away from that screen. There's no reason to keep them intent on watching. And I think that, to be fair, I think a lot of educational groups are learning also about how to use technology for education, and we may be sometimes over ambitious in what we think kids can do. I have been sitting in on a class, and a 3-hour class on Zoom, even one in which I'm interested in the content, is just too darn long for me. I can't sustain myself that long. So I think you really need to pay attention to how your child's reacting. And I think educators are going to learn over time through this extensive test case process that we need to think a little bit less creatively, that just putting a class on Zoom is not the same as being in a classroom with the children.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you know, it's interesting because I spend now basically 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day on Zoom, and I find it exhausting. I mean, it is clearly much more cognitively draining than the 8 or 9 hours a day I would spend in my office, in large part meeting with people. I think we convinced ourselves that this is really a substitute for human interaction, and even though it's a much better approximation than simply talking on the phone, it doesn't substitute. I think it's I guess, for lack of a better word, it's draining, it's tiring, it's not the same thing. And it has a lot of implications, I think, for distance learning, if this is going to be the new model of the future.
I think we're going to learn a lot about how to use it more effectively than we are right now. And that goes across the board, from preschool educational institutions through higher education and in professional education settings.
I think really, oh, go ahead, Brandon.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think we just, again, need to remember the developmental age of the children that we're talking about, and the best ways that they learn are with face-to-face interactions and manipulating and interacting with their environment and with objects and all of those sorts of experiences. And that's what's best for their developing minds. And so just sitting, I mean, if you're stuck in a situation where it was like, well, they're going to use this screen or they're going to be watching this SpongeBob, I mean, like, yeah, that reading the book or having their teacher sitting there reading the book to them is much better. So again, you know, you can balance those things, but children need to be interacting with their environment and able to manipulate things. That's how they're best going to learn and really develop over time. And they also need, if you're going to be having them do screens, let's say a kindergartner doing some e-learning with screens, they're going to need frequent breaks. Yeah. And and good, high quality, frequent breaks of like high quality interacting with their environment and able to manipulate toys and play and maybe play with an adult and all of that, so that they can then refocus on the task at hand. And if you don't do that, it's going to be honestly, it's going to be a disaster. That's where you're going to start getting into those, they don't want to do it, or it's just a meltdown, or they're not getting anything out of it. They've got to have those breaks.
And one other thing that I think is important to keep in mind with this is that, first of all, the educators are to be congratulated for trying to adapt their curriculum to online platforms, especially, for example, like Montessori curriculum, which is a very multisensorial experience. It's all about blocks and sandpaper and stuff, and then you're trying to take that online. So they're really trying to figure it out as they go along in very unusual circumstances. But one question that's really not yet clear in terms of screen-based learning at this age is how well skills that are learned on a screen translate into the real world. That's also, very controversial in adults whose brains are fully developed. So for example, if a child is learning on an app or through a video, and it seems like, oh my gosh, they're really good at that app where they're touching their letters or whatever it is, we don't really know if that's going to mean that they can do it in the real world, that they can read or they can do something else. And so there really is some caution in order when curricula are presented through screens at this age, whether it's through a school or on an app, the degree to which those are going to translate into the real world. It should really at this age be all about taking what's on the screen and practicing it in the real world to develop those skills in the best way, as Brandon said.
Yeah, some of what you're talking about, John, it's an area called transfer tasks, and we don't have enough of them, but we do have some studies that have been done in the last 4 or 5 years on young children and transfer tasks. And one of the things we know is that if you show them a video of, let's say, of a child trying to find a toy that's been hidden in a room, that if the transfer, if there is not interactivity in what you're showing, then if the child cannot interact with the content, then the transfer doesn't take place. That transfer and learning happens more often when they're into new settings, when there is an interactive nature to the video that's being shown. And this research is pretty much preliminary, and you're right. We don't know enough about the interactivity and what constitutes interactivity in programs for young children that will enable them to transfer the learning from the screen into the real world environment.
Let's see, we have time for a few more questions. Is it okay for children to watch TV and use iPads in their bedrooms? And should we be concerned about background screen time? Parents are watching something on TV while parents are playing in the same room. Kids are, those are 2 questions from one person. So let's take the first one. TV, iPad in the bedroom.
No.
Ellen says no. I'll just do a quick round of horn.
I really feel strongly about that you should keep the technology out of the bedroom for young children.
Okay. John?
Really among the screen time evidence, there's some of the strongest evidence that TV in the bedroom or any screen in the bedroom is one of the worst things for multiple aspects of child development and health. So yeah, keep it out.
Brandon?
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly to keep the technology out of the young child's bedroom.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we're talking about young children, and subsequent seminars we'll talk about older kids. And the advice we're giving, part of what I think is important around media habits in young children, is that it sets the stage for how they interact with it later, right? We talk about media diet, we could talk about food diet, and we try to establish healthy eating habits early in life because we think they carry into later childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. I think the same is true here. I think there's a lot of reasons to keep the adolescents' bedrooms as technologically free as possible, particularly before bedtime. And so setting the stage early or setting up expectations early is probably a good thing.
And I'd like to, really quick, I'd like to just turn that on ourselves too, thinking about parents, that we need to be thinking about our own digital habits and how we're using our devices, whether we're using them around our children and how we're using them around our children, how we're communicating around those. If we're taking them into our bedrooms, how we use it in our bedrooms, all these things, it'd be rather hypocritical of us to say that they can't have any of those things and then we do it all the time. And I know that the developmental needs of us versus a young child are different, and so we can do different things and have some of these different privileges, But if we want to set up these really nice, healthy digital habits in our families, a lot of times the modeling of the behaviors that we do, especially for young children, they'll pick up on those. And it'll make things go a lot easier in your family if you're doing what you say and teach.
No, I think it's a really excellent point. I mean, parents are children's first and most important role models, and we don't emphasize enough that your media use, even when your child is as young as 6 and 8 months of age, the fact that they see you holding a cell phone all the time imparts to it a value. They already know how to associate that, and it's not coincidental that a popular toddler toy is a fake, quote unquote, cell phone. It's because they've already come to view it as something that's desirable because they see their parents using it. So always keep in mind that they're watching you, and what you do conveys a lot of meaning to them. What about this issue of background screen time? So parents are trying to entertain themselves at home, and they have a 1 and a 3-year-old in this case that are playing in the same room. What do people think of that?
Background television also has very strong evidence it can be very distracting for kids. You know, kids that are trying to play and build with blocks, and then they hear this noise in the background and see this flashing light and all this stuff going on, and the parents are all watching it. They're going to be drawn to that like a moth to a porch light. And you know, that's clearly a very distracting element that can really interfere with their ability to get the most out of whatever it is they're doing, whether it's toys or a book or anything. Recently, background screens has been compared to secondhand smoke, you know, in terms of the ability to sort of impact a child's development. You know, just having that kind of going on while the child's in the same room can potentially really negatively impact their health and development.
Yeah, John's right. The major finding that I know out of the literature on the effects of background screens on young children and their viewing is that it's very distracting. And if the child is trying to do something else, it distracts them from paying attention to that. And so that in that sense, it's problematic. And also it depends on what that content is in the background. If you're worried about violence and or sexualized content, you think that your 2 or 3-year-old is not paying attention, you're wrong.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. And John already talked about it, but several people have asked about this issue of digital books and reading to your child on an iPad or other device. Is that to be encouraged? Is it equivalent to reading a regular book?
Digital books are really interesting in the sense that, again, the more like a regular book a digital book can be in terms of keeping it very simple and having just the words and the pictures, and then having a grown-up to actually read the book. It doesn't matter if it's a physical book or an ebook. Where the ebooks kind of go off the road a little bit is when they have too many of these enhanced features, too many bells and whistles and things going off that can just be very distracting for kids. And we've done some research looking at differences between animated content, regular picture book content, and audio, and found there really are some differences in how brain networks seem to engage during those different formats. And so at this age, really the classic sort of picture book, words, pictures, and person is really where you're going to get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah, and I would add that we lump these ebooks as we talk about ebooks as an entity, but I think that the platform actually matters, because when you talk about reading on an iPad, I think the challenge there is, even if it's a quote unquote regular ebook without any enhanced features, the child associates the iPad itself with a toy that can do other things. So there's at least a couple of studies now that on an iPad, the child is much more likely to pull it away, to try to switch the narrative, switch the content, try to get the iPad to do something else. Not because the physical act of reading on a screen is distracting, but the iPad itself, with other things that they can do. So not all ebooks are the same either anymore. Okay, I think with that, I want to thank you for the time. I know you have a lot of other things to do in your quarantine state, and I want to kick it back to our leader and the founder and president of Children and Screens, who has done so much to help children live healthy lives in a digital world. In addition to bringing all of us together, she convenes regular panels for parents and educators and other researchers, and we have periodic national congresses that convene transdisciplinary experts from all over the world to help bring you the latest and best information about children and screens. Pam?
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you all for coming and to the extraordinary panelists. Please sign up for the next Children and Screens workshops in the series and share information about them with your friends and family members and your network. On Wednesday, May 6th at noon Eastern, we will host a panel focusing on mid-childhood years, ages 5 to 12. The final panel, Teens and Screens During COVID-19, will be on Tuesday, May 12th, again at 12 p.m. Please sign up and submit your questions. We'll try to answer as many as we can. When you leave the workshop, there'll be a link to a short survey. Please click on the link and let us know what you thought about the workshop. Thanks again and be well. Did everybody hear that?
Yes, thank you very much, Pam.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, John. And thank you, Brandon.
Thank you, everybody. as
Stay safe,
well.
all.
Thank
Good luck,
you.
everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you.